Hello, this is Thomas Pepin NHL Talk. I'm Thomas Pepin, and let's talk about the NHL. So I had a couple issues with streaming previously for this part, so my apologies there. I'm going to restart just so that I can get some continuity with everything. So unfortunately, just burnt half an hour going through one team, but in any case, we'll play it back. So, this is the eighth part of an eight-part series evaluating teams' cap management. And so, this is the second half of the teams of the Atlantic Division, including Toronto Maple Leafs, Boston Bruins, Tampa Bay Lightning, and Florida Panthers that I'm going to be covering. And again, the way this works is I first start with their overall cap position, then break it down position by position. So forwards, defense, goalies, talk about the salaries on the books, their flexibility in terms of term for those contracts, and then give an overall grade for the team. And so let's make another attempt at this and go for the Toronto Maple Leafs to start. And I just want to double check that everything is good at the moment. So just bear with me a quick second to make sure it is live. And it is. Okay, good. So, all right. So current cap hit for the Leafs is 89.243 million. Kyle Dubas is the GM. Starting with the forwards, we have Austin Matthews, 11.64 million per 2 years remaining on a 5-year contract. Last year, he had 106 points, 60 goals in 73 games, 66 points, 41 goals in 52 games, 80 goals, 80 points, 47 goals in 70 games, and 73 points, 37 goals in 68 games for the rest of the previous 3 seasons. So around a high 30, 40 goal scorer on average. And over a point per game or about a point per game, somewhere around there. So was signed in 2019 after 2 good years of 30 plus goals and about a point per game. So yeah, based on the way that I like to, or how I would do things as a GM, is about 2 years of experience and then give them a good contract if they're a player with good pedigree and should develop over the years. So for Austin Matthews, 2 years, sign the contract, preferably what I would want 8 years instead of the 5 years that he was signed. Also, that increases the likelihood that the contract's going to be less on a per year basis, and locks them up long term because you'd assume that their performance is going to continue. So that's what I would have done. In this case, 5 years I'd say is short, but there could have been some other rationale to do it. So give him the benefit of the doubt. In terms of cap hit, definitely market value at the time of the contract. for 30 some odd goals and about a point per game, maybe 11.6 million, 11.64 million per is steep, but again, market value. So it's reasonable. So anyways, I would have tried to do less dollar figure, longer term, for his contract. But what they did was, I guess, like I said, market value. So not a bad contract, just not what I would do. John Tavares, 11 million per, 3 years remaining on a 7-year contract. Last year, 76 points, 27 goals in 79 games, 50 points in 56 games, 60 points with 26 goals in 63 games, 88 points, 47 goals in 82 games. Was signed in 2018. After a number of 30 some odd goals and a point per game, a number of years with that kind of performance. So again, same thing as Matthews, definitely market value. It expires when he's 35, which is a great time to have it expire, because then hopefully you'll be able to get a lower dollar figure thereafter. So great contract in terms of market value, but already we're at 2 contracts at or above 11 million, and that doesn't leave you much space if it continues, which, as we'll see next, it does. Then we have Mitch Marner making 10.9 million per, 3 years remaining on a 3-year contract. Last year, 97 points, 35 goals in 72 games, 67 points, 20 goals in 55 games, 67 points, 59 games, 94 points, 26 goals in 82 games. So 20 plus goal scorer, over a point per game, was signed in 2019 after 3 good years. And so at that cap hit, I'd say maybe slightly high, maybe he's more of a $9 million player. But if you're projecting that he's going to be a 30 some odd goal scorer and over a point per game, then clearly he's worth it. So again, market value, yes, reasonable, within range of market value. Would I spend that much? No. And the problem is because you can't round out a good roster. So, like I said, we got 3 players now. Oh, and the other thing is 6 years instead of 8 years. So that's where you could have maybe gotten a lower dollar figure. So again, probably could have been done better. Easy for me to say, not being a GM, but still. And then next up, William Nylander, 6.962 million per, 2 years remaining on a 6-year contract. Last year, 80 points, 34 goals in 81 games, 42 points in 51 games, 59 points with 31 goals in 68 games, 27 points in 54 games. So somewhere 20 plus goal scorer at or just under a point per game. Was signed in 2018, which would have been after back-to-back good years, 20 goals, 61 points. So at 6.962 per, definitely worth it. In terms of market value, would I want it slightly less? Yes. So, again, nothing wrong with it. And then also probably would have wanted 8 years for him too, because maybe he could have gotten less. So another contract, perfectly fine, reasonably well done. Now, that's it for forwards, but you combine all the cap hits of the forwards, and already we're starting to see a problem. So 55 million divided by total cap space of 82.5 is 66.7% spent on forwards. That's not necessarily wrong. It's probably right in terms of percentage. But the problem is that cap space is essentially filled by 4 players. So between the 4 players, it is, give me a second to do the math here. So that's 33.5 plus 7 is 40.5. So 40.5 million divided by 82.5. So 49.1% of their cap space is spent on 4 players. That, as far as I can tell, is going to create a problem. And we'll get to that here after we've gone over the next players. So moving to defensemen here, Morgan Riley, 7.5 million per, 8 years remaining on an 8-year contract. 68 points in 82 games, 35 points in 55 games, 27 points in 47 games, 72 points with 20 goals in 82 games. So a really high producing defenseman, was signed in 2021. So after a number of decent years of production. So, I mean, at a cap hit of 7.5, I'd much rather that than the Dougie Hamilton contract of, I think it was 9 million. Because right there you save 1.5 million, get a, I think, better production out of Morgan Riley, which leaves you space to spend on somebody else. So I think a great contract, 8 years instead of with the other guys, got the term that you would want. So I'd say really good job. This is exactly what I would want to do for a contract. Now, is it a bit much to spend on a defenseman? Probably, but with the production, for me, it's right what I would be willing to do. So I think it's great. Next up, TJ Brody, 5 million per, 2 years remaining on a 4-year contract. Excuse me. 28 points in 82 games, 14 points in 56, 19 in 64, 34 in 79. So somewhere around a 30-point defenseman, signed in 2020 after mostly years of 30 points. And 30 points at 5 million, I'd say, is maybe a bit high, but it's market value again. I would have probably tried to get 4.5, but that's easier said than done. So it expires when he's 34, maybe a year too early, but that's still close enough. So perfectly fine in terms of market value. Just I would have tried to get less. But that's easier said than done. And then last for defenseman Jake Muzzin, 5.625 per, 2 years remaining on a 4-year contract. Last year, 14 points in 47 games, 27 points in 53, 23 in 53, and 37 in 80. So somewhere around a 30-point defenseman, it looks like. Signed in 2020 after everything looked kind of normal, but had missed a bit of time with the Leafs. So reasonable performance, maybe again, probably slightly high for what he was paid, or what you would want to pay, but market value within range, perfectly fine. It expires when he's 35, which is perfect timing. So everything's fine with that too. But what we run into now here is we have 55 million plus. Give me a second to do a bit of math here. So if you have Jake Muzzin in and Victor Mete out, because Jake Muzzin's on LTIR, then the cap hit is approximately 77.875 million for forwards and defense. And divided by 82.5 million is 94% spent, 94.4% spent on forwards and defense, which the actual dollar amount is, in 1 second, $4.6 million left to spend on 2 goalies. And if you want to have a good team, I would say that's probably not enough. Anyways, we will move on to Matt Murray. Sorry, I should have said, I forgot to say actually for forwards too. So the core for the forwards is 2 to 3 years, so lots of flexibility there. And then defensemen, 2 to 8 years, but mostly 2 years or less. So lots of flexibility, except for Riley, which is perfectly fine. And then, so now moving to Matt Murray, he has a cap hit of 4.688 per, 2 years remaining on a 4-year contract. Last year, 906 save percentage in 20 games, 80 or 0.893 in 27 games the year before, 0.899 in 38 games, and then 0.919 in 50 games. So going back to his Pittsburgh years, looks more along the lines of 907 plus, probably on average a 9-1 something goalie, which is perfectly good for a starter. And there was retained salary in the trade with Ottawa, and it was 6.25 million, which again, for his track record, because he's won, I think, 2 Stanley Cups, definitely worth the 6.25 at the time of the signing, and especially still worth the 4.688 as it stands with the salary retained. So yeah, so great contract uh, in all regards. To sign him for 4 years after he had the 1 year that wasn't as good, that gave good flexibility. So in Ottawa, that was a good signing. Good for Toronto to pick up, only 2 years left. So everything's fine there. So good contract. Now, this is where we run into trouble with Toronto, which is uh, if we add the Murray contract to the team with a healthy Muzzin, that means that cap hit is, just give me a second for the math. $84.4 million approximately. So the problem here is that they're over the cap. So altogether, their cap management can't be seen as perfectly good. Are all the contracts fine? Yes. Is overall the management good? It can't be because they're over the cap. So the positive here is that if they were to reduce their salary to be at cap by getting rid of somebody, it's 1.8, about 1.87 million you need to get rid of, which is, I mean, a Yarn Croc or Justin Hall. And would that dramatically impact the performance of the team? Probably not. So, as it stands, if you think the team is good, even though they're over the cap, you could still conceivably say that the team's okay uh, because they could trade away a contract probably. So, um, the problem here is I have them missing the playoffs. I don't think the team's good enough. Because when you think about it, you've got a team with all the salaries split between 7 players. So 4 forwards, 3 defensemen. That's not even essentially 1.5 lines. So you shut down one line, then what happens to the team? So let's say you split the forwards 2 lines. Okay. Um, defensemen, you got a line and a half. So right away you're running into trouble there of being able to match up against other teams. So you'd have to powerhouse them like you run over them with a couple, like one good line or maybe 2 good lines. But I don't see, I mean, it could happen with these players, but the rest of the roster is just not good enough in my opinion. So um and then I mean the goaltending tandem I would say is probably okay in my opinion. Most people would probably see it differently, but I think combined between Matt Murray and Samsonov, maybe it could be good enough goaltending. But um, I think they need one more good defenseman, 2 more forwards. It's just not well rounded enough. So, anyways, for being over the cap, for having what I would say is not a good enough team to win a Stanley Cup, you've seen already they can't make it past the first round. And like I said, I don't think they'll make the playoffs. So, but if they do, probably can't get past the first round. So it's impossible for me to give them that high of a grade, even though the contracts are not bad necessarily. And the flexibility is fine. So because everything's done reasonably well, I can give them a decent grade, but I can't give them too high of a grade because I just don't think the team's well-rounded enough or deep enough. So I'll give them a B plus. It looks like they'll always be a competitive team. And I mean, for the next 2 to 3 years, because that's what they have more or less for the contracts. But thereafter, I don't know how they're going to manage the team. They're going to have to lose people, or I think it's going to be a mess in Toronto in 4 years. So, but we'll see. So, anyways, B plus for Toronto. Not really all that bad. Just I don't think a good enough team to win a cup. Next up is Boston, I believe. Boston Bruins. And Boston is currently at 84.375 million. Don Sweeney's their GM. And already you can contrast the makeup of this roster and the cap spending with Toronto. So David Pastrnak making 6.667 per 1 year remaining on a 6-year contract. Last year, 77 points, 40 goals in 72 games, 48 points, 20 goals in 48, 95 points, 48 goals in 70 games, 81 points, 38 goals in 66. Consistently a 30 some odd goal scorer, over a point per game. And he's making 6.667 million per. So right away, that's a steal of a contract. But we'll have to see the time that it was made. So it was made in 2017 after 2 decent years and 1 good year. Or I should say 2 mediocre years and 1 good year. Good pedigree, first round pick, played World Junior. So, I mean, you could project him to continue performing. Was signed to 6 years, which I would say is not a bad idea given that his first 2 years were kind of mediocre. He had 1 great year, so not bad to keep it 2 years shorter than the 8-year mark. So, not a bad idea. Could have done 8, but 6 years is reasonable. And at that amount, given that he had the 1 really good year, which was 34 goals, 70 points in 75 games, I mean, that was a really good contract to sign. So they did really, really well. Now, yeah, let's just go back to Toronto just for fun. We had Austin Matthews was signed after 3 good years and is making double. So, I mean, but Pasternak's first good year, or a good year just prior to the contract, 34 goals, 70 points in 75 games. Austin Matthews, well, the best of those were, we'll go with 37 goals, 73 points, and 68. So 34 goals versus 37 goals for Matthews. 70 points versus 73 points for Matthews. So, I mean, yeah, with Matthews having a better track record, like more consistent, then yeah, he'd get paid more. But double? I don't know about that. So clearly, Boston understood about managing their cap. Toronto paid market value, but that's not managing the cap well. So that's first one. Next up, Brad Marchand. Marchand. Anyways, he's making 6.125 per 3 years remaining on an 8-year contract. Last year, 80 points, 32 goals in 70 games, 69 points, 29 goals in 53, 87 points, 28 goals in 70, 100 points, 36 goals in 79. So 30 some odd goal scorer, over a point per game. Very impressive across the board. Playoff performer. Everything about him is fantastic. But anyways, signed in 2016 after numerous years of 20 some odd goals and under a point per game. So actually, he started to perform after his contract, but still close. So the timing was great. Signed him up or locked him up long term, 8 years. Smart move because he had good pedigree. Even though he was a third round pick, he was World Juniors and was quite good. So, yeah, so really good job signing him long term and at a steal of a deal. 6.125 is like, even if he continued to perform at the same level and never got better, it still would have been a good contract. So, so very, very well done there as well. Taylor Hall, $6 million per 3 years remaining on a 4-year contract. Last year, 61 points, 20 goals in 81 games, 33 points in 53 games, 27 points in, or sorry, 52 points in 65 games, and 37 points in 33 games. So dipped versus his earlier performance, but still a good player. Probably somewhere around 20 goal scorer and under a point per game. Was signed in 2021. So after he had dipped in his performance. And at a cap hit of 6 million, I'd say is maybe slightly high. But I think because he had a number of good years before, it kind of influenced their ability to get less. So still definitely market value, but maybe could have been slightly lower. But anyways, still great contract. It expires when he's 33, which is maybe a bit early. You'd maybe want it to expire at 35. So it could have maybe been 6 years instead. But because his performance dipped, maybe you want it shorter. So anyways, all things considered, great contract to have on the books there. Next one, Charlie Coyle, 5.25 million per 4 years remaining on a 6-year contract. last year, 44 points in 82 games, 16 and 51, 37 and 70, and then 34 and 81. So around a 30-point score, not the highest of production. So 30 some odd point score, maybe 35 or so, or even the high 30s. But yeah, it was signed 2019. After a normal year. 5.25 is maybe a bit high. Yeah. So, and it expires when he's 34. Good timing. Maybe a year longer would be okay. But 6 years is fine. Performance wasn't, I mean, it dipped slightly when he was signed. So maybe shorter's like 6 years is good. Just the dollar figure is a bit high again. So him more around 4 some odd million, it would be better. 4.7 or something like that. So bit high, but still market value. So nothing wrong with that there. Then that's it for forwards. So their core is around 1 to 4 years. So some flexibility there. All the contracts are cheap, so quite good. I feel like we're missing someone though. Oh, it's because they signed for such a low cost. So I was just thinking about Bergeron and Krejci, but I mean, 2.5 and 1 million respectively. That's nothing. Jeez, what a steal. But anyways, so moving to defensemen, Hampus Lindholm, 6.5 million per, 8 years remaining on an 8-year contract. Last year, 27 points in 71 games, 6 and 18, 23 and 56, 28 and 76. So he's dipped as of late, but a 20 some odd point defenseman, 25 or so. Was signed in 2022. Halfway through an average year. 6.5 million for that production, I would say, is high. You'd probably want him at about 4.5 to 5, but still market value, so not bad. I mean, he has great pedigree, has played well before in Anaheim. So it expires when he is 36, maybe a year late, but still reasonable. So not the best contract, is to market value, but probably up to $2 million higher than I would want. So anyways, not bad contract, but not good either, I'd say. Then there's Brandon Carlo, 4.1 million per, 5 years remaining on a 6-year contract. Last year, 15 points in 79 games, 4 in 27, 19 in 67, 10 in 72. So not much production. 4.1 million seems a bit steep. Probably would want 3 million. I don't know enough about his usage, because if he's a defensive defenseman with, that kind of performance, maybe he's worth it, but still seems a bit steep. So it expires when he is 30. given his track record, maybe that's fine because you want to be able to get out of it if he doesn't perform. So in that case, maybe 6 years is long. I don't know. I don't think it's the best contract, but again, it's market value. Everything's normal there. And last up for defenseman, Charlie McAvoy, $9.5 million per 8 years remaining on an 8-year contract. Last year, 56 points in 78 games, 30 and 51, 32 and 67, 28 and 54. So around at least a 30-point defenseman, upwards to last year's 56. So great defenseman, was signed in 2021 after 3 years of pretty much the same performance. Great pedigree, first round pick, played World Junior. So to lock up to 8 years is great. 9.5. Again, you go back and you contrast with what we saw in Toronto for Morgan Riley, 7.5 for approximately the same track record at the time of signing, same pedigree, and lower dollar figures. So that's where I think it's just poor negotiations. Maybe if you're projecting him to be better than Riley, but I wouldn't be projecting that high. So, like if you think he's the next Cale Makar, but he's not, I would say, or at least I. Anyways, just not what I would do for the dollar figure. Still, it's market value. He's worth it on the market, but I wouldn't have done that high. So, not a good contract to me, but not bad. So for defensemen, they're locked up for 8 years for 2 of them, which is a lot. 5 years for another, and then the rest 2 years. So not much flexibility. They're really committing to those guys, and they're good. Just maybe too much money spent. I think they're going to run into trouble because the forwards, once their contracts expire, and if they ask for what they're worth, they won't be able to afford this team anymore. So not bad, but it doesn't look like they're going to be in good shape moving forward. Linus Ullmark, $5 million per 3 years remaining on a 4-year contract. Last year, 917 save percentage in 41 games, 917 in 20 games, 915 in 34 games, 905 in 37. So a 9-1 something save percentage goalie, which is quite good. Was a 6th-round pick, so not the best pedigree, but has enough of a track record, just not as a starter. So that's where, well, let's see when it was signed. It was signed in 2021 after 3 years of 20 to 37 games. So not much of a track record. To sign to $5 million, it's bold. So I think that's definitely an overpay. Still market value, maybe, but it can't. It seems still high even on market value. He's probably would have at the time, based on the history, been worth 3.5 because he just didn't play enough games. So I don't like that contract. Maybe justifiable market value, but I think it's too high. So altogether for Boston, forwards lots of flexibility, defensemen not so much. Super good contracts for the forwards, but defensemen, maybe a bit high. Still not that crazy, but yeah, I mean, a $9.5 million defenseman, it's expensive. Lindholm, given his performance, expensive. Carlo, given his performance, expensive. And then, yeah, it's great with all the contracts up front, but they expire in 1 to 3 years. And then how are you going to be able to afford those players? It's going to be tough. So, altogether, I mean, a couple things here and there that I don't think are good. Not bad either. I'd say they have more of an ability. No, and I was going to say they have more of an ability to be in good shape moving forward than Toronto, but not really, because they have people locked up, and both of them have players expiring at approximately, well, basically the exact same time. So I'd say it's pretty much in the same boat as Toronto. Couple of overpays, some good contracts. So I'd say again, probably a B plus. Just again, like Toronto, in 2 to 3 years, they're going to start to run into trouble with expiring contracts. In this, well, actually, in both cases, the forwards. So, anyways, next up is Tampa, now managed by Julian Brisebois. Cap hit of 90.654 million, which is higher than what it's supposed to be. But I guess, yeah, there's the Brent Seabrook contract, so maybe I shouldn't be laughing quite right away. But anyway, so starting with Kucherov, 9.5 million per 5 years remaining on an 8-year contract. Last year, 69 points, 25 goals in 47 games, 85 points, 33 goals in 68. After missing 1 year in between, I was out for the full year. 128 points, 41 goals in 82 games, 100 points, 39 goals in 80 games. So he's right up there with McDavid. So in previous streams, I talked about players that are worth the high contracts, like 12 million or whatever. I'd put him in that boat. I mean, look at his playoff performance. It's nuts. I didn't know it was this high. 154 points in 136 games. To be over a point per game in the playoffs, like, it's unreal. And to put up 30, 40 goals a year and hit 100 points a couple of years, like, man, he's a hell of a player. But anyways, was signed in 2018 after a 100-point year. So, I mean, in previous years were basically a point per game and 30 goals a year. So great track record. 9.5 is quite reasonable even at the time. And over time, that's going to become even cheaper with inflation in the NHL. So one of the best players in the league, put him right up there with McDavid, Draisaitl. 9.5 is, I'd say, it's if you're as good as McDavid and Draisaitl and you're making less than McDavid and slightly more than Draisaitl, I mean, it's a great contract. So really well done there. I mean, maybe if you'd maybe want it slightly less to round out the roster, but it's perfectly reasonable. Contrast that with Marner, Matthews. It's about the same, but getting paid less, $2 million less versus Matthews. So great contract. Braden Point, $9.5 million per, 8 years remaining on an 8-year contract. Last year, 58 points, 28 goals in 66 games, 48 points, 23 goals in 56, 64, 25 goals in 66, 92, 41 goals in 79. So somewhere around a high 20 to 30 goal scorer, around a point per game, maybe slightly less. Another playoff performer, 78 points in 76 games. Stud of a player. Was signed in 2021 after one really good year and a few decent years, or decent by his standards, I'll say. All like 20 some odd goals and under a point per game, but close. So, him, I'd maybe say it's a bit overpaid. Now, this was signed by Brisebois. Had it been Yzerman, I think Yzerman would have been able to get less. So, maybe, but it's hard to say. Anyways, it's definitely market value. Would be nice to have him more towards $8.5 million or so, but that's easier said than done. So, like I said, market value, but could have been it could have been better. And I should have checked I'll go back and check on Kucherov, but this one expires when he's 34. Great timing. Kucherov expires when he is 5 years, is 34. So good timing again. Next up, Stamkos, $8.5 million per, 2 years remaining on an 8-year contract. Last year, 106 points, 42 goals in 81 games, 34 points in 38, 66 with 29 goals in 57, 98, 45 goals in 82. So a bit of fluctuation there, but 30 to 40 goal scorer, maybe even more. I mean, he's had 60 one year. Basically a point per game in the playoffs. Good leader from what I've heard. Was signed in 2016, another Steve Yzerman contract, which was after a number of his really good years where he dipped slightly but still was producing at nearly the same pace. So 8.5, 8 years, you lock him up, which is what you want to do with your best players. So just going back to Kucherov and Point, 8-year contracts. Like, you get stud players, you lock them up. And so once again, did that with Stamkos. So 8.5 for his performance. I mean, he's gotten 60 goals, could conceivably have gotten that again after, even though he dipped in his performance. 8.5 for that. I mean, again, great contract. And so those three players, again, it's kind of skewed a bit differently because the contracts were signed at different times compared to Toronto, but nonetheless, three players, and between them compared to Toronto, so it was basically 11 times 3 in Toronto, so 33 million versus, well, rather than use my brain, let's just use a calculator. 9.5 plus 9 point plus 8.5. So 27.5 million, which is a difference of 5.5 million. So 5.5 million you're saving on the three players in Tampa versus the three players in Toronto. Are those three players comparable between the two teams? Yeah. I mean, if the teams flip those players, would you notice much of a difference in team performance? Probably not. It would be pretty darn close. But one team's got 5.5 million space to spend on somebody else. That's a lot. That's a good defenseman. A reasonable production forward. That's a lot. So that's the difference between good management and not so good management. Market value versus good negotiations and putting together a good roster. So, yeah. So, looking at the core for forwards, it's I think point again was just he just started his 8 years, so it's between 2 and 8 years more or less for the core. Everybody that should be locked up is everybody else was and is just having their contracts expire. So, and otherwise, lots of flexibility, 1 to 2 years for the rest of the guys. So, great job for forwards. Lots of flexibility where you need it, and no flexibility in certain spots, but you don't need it with the players that they have. So, now going to just before we go, so Sorelli is 4.8, 1 year remaining on a 3-year contract, but so he's below my threshold that I usually stop at is 5 million for forwards, but in this case, because he has the extension, so next year brings him into an 8-year contract of 6.25 million per. Last year, 43 points in 76 games, 22 in 50, 44 in 68, and 39 in 82. Was signed in 2020 after 2 decent years for him. It was a short year because he just made it into the NHL, and then a decent year and half of a year. So enough of a track record where you could lock a guy up, but they only went with 3 years. So, and that was Brisebois who signed it. So I think he's a 3rd round pick, but I thought he did play World Juniors. Yeah. So, and was good there. So decent pedigree. Maybe should have been locked up long term. If you locked him up long term, maybe 4 something million, because he was 4.8, 4 something million, and have him for 8 years. That'd be much better than having to re-sign him at 6.25 for now 8 years. So this is where I'd contrast the management of Brisebois versus Yzerman. Yzerman probably wouldn't have done things in this way. Whereas Brisebois, I don't think is as good of a manager with this as a great example. So timing, dollar figure, 6.25 per for a guy that's doing 40 some odd points. That's a bit high, I would say. Maybe you think he's trending up, and then maybe in the end he's going to be worth it. Yeah, I just I think there's a difference clearly in management. So not a bad contract, but not an Yzerman contract, I guess is a good way to put it. So anyways, that's it for forwards. That's one I would say I don't like that much, but not the worst. Defenseman Victor Hedman, 7.875 per, 3 years remaining on an 8-year contract, another Yzerman contract. Last year, 85 points, 20 goals in 82 games, 45 points in 54, 55 in 66, 54 in 70. So, stud of a defenseman, 50 or more points consistently. Like, geez. I think this is the year he was MVP, 22 points in 25 games. That was the 2020 playoffs. If I'm not mistaken, that's when he got MVP. So, anyways, yeah, clearly a great player. Contract was signed in 2016, which was after. So he had 4 kind of mediocre years by his standards, and then 3 good years, or decent years by his standards. Good to or decent to good years, and then was signed. And had a cap hit, maybe based on his track record, that's a bit high, 7.875. But I know he's good defensively as well. So a bit more money for him, and he's a leader on the team. So maybe if I'm being picky, it could have been negotiated better, but it's definitely market value and on the lower end of market value. But I'm just critiquing Yzerman versus Yzerman. So maybe Yzerman could have done better, uh, given how good he is. So, but anyways, great contract, and I mean, geez, last year, great production. So, and a steal versus like a Makar contract. So, anyways, Mikhail Sergachev, currently last year of a 3-year contract, 4.8 million, and then it goes into next year at 8.5 for 8 years. Last year, 38 points in 78 games, 30 in 56, 34 in 70, 32 in 75. So a mid 30s defenseman. This expiring contract was signed in 2020 after 3 decent years. So the current contract, 4.8, is great. Like, that's a great deal. But the problem is what they should have done instead of signing him 3 years is 8 years. If there's a reason for it, I don't know. But I mean, he's the kind of guy based on that track record. I think he was a first round pick. Great pedigree. I mean, you would have wanted to lock him up long term. So that's a mistake there. And that contract was done by Brisebois. So I think, again, a way to contrast versus Yzerman. And then 8.5, given that performance, 30 some odd point defenseman, 8.5, I think is steep. So good that they locked him up 8 years, but for what he produces, I don't think he's worth 8.5. Still market value, but yeah, just high. And then so you can't really round out the roster as well. So yeah. Don't really like that contract, but it's market value, so can't really say too much negative about it. And it expires when he's 33, so good timing, but just the way that all the timing worked out, I don't think it's good. And then I just noticed there's an extension on Cernak. I didn't know he was extended. So currently on the last year of a 3-year contract, 2.95 per. Last year, 13 points in 55 games, 18 in 46, 12 in 67, 16 in 58. I think he's a defensive defenseman, if I'm not mistaken. But that's not much production. Was signed in 2020. After 2, mediocre years. At 2.95 was fine. Like, that's reasonable market value. So perfectly fine what they did there. Actually, I didn't realize, but he does have good pedigree. He was a second-round pick, played World Junior for a number of years, actually. So, yeah, so that contract's fine. Again, one of those guys maybe you could have locked up longer term if, in fact, he's if he's good now, because like I said, with the stats, they're not that great, but maybe he's a good defensive defenseman. I don't know enough about him, but if that is true, then they should have locked up the 8 years before, not now. So another mistake I see, at least. And then he goes into a $5.2 million contract, which is too expensive. So, and that expires when he's 33. So good timing there. So it's is it the reverse? Yeah, so that would be the reverse. So you'd want 8 years at a lower dollar figure and then end 3 years at potentially a higher dollar figure. But if you can't afford it, then you trade him. So again, Brisebois versus Yzerman, I think Yzerman wouldn't have done the timing this way. So, but who's to say? So I don't think a good contract the way that it happened. So, so not much flexibility. Some decent players locked up, but the core is kind of 2 to 8 years. Well, 9 years because you add in the expiring contracts. So long term, good players, fine. Maybe a bit overpays and bad timing. So, and then moving to Vasilevsky, I'd say the best goalie in the league. I think most people would, but I guess it's arguable. 9.5 million per, 6 years remaining on an 8-year contract. I don't really know if I need to go through his stats. 916 in 63 games, 925 in 42, 917 in 52, 925 in 53. I mean, 9-2-2, 9-3-7, 9-2-7 in playoffs, like unreal stats. Now, this was signed 2019. It was in the summer. Huh. So it was before all the Stanley Cups. Was it before all the Stanley? It was before all the Stanley Cups that they signed him at 9.5 million. Could you have known that he was that good of a goalie at that time? I guess so. But at 9.5 million, 9.5 million now makes sense if he got that, because it's clear that he's again, in my opinion, the best goalie in the league, but it's clear that at least he's worth that if you would spend it. So, but it's just, I don't know. It seems early to commit 9.5 million to him, even though his stats are good, even though his pedigree is really good at that time. So, I mean, it's the same thing like Carey Price, but Carey Price, I think, had good playoffs at the time. So, give me a second here. I just want to see. So, Carey Price was 10.5, so more expensive, $1 million difference. And at the time of Carey Price's contract, he had been in multiple playoffs and had played well in multiple playoffs and played well in regular season. So whereas Vasilevsky played well in one playoff run. So I don't know. Again, obviously market value, he's worth it. At the time, just I think it seems like a bit of a gamble. Yeah, obviously it wasn't in the end, but I would have tried to avoid that. And again, this was done by Brisebois, whereas with Yzerman, I think Yzerman could have gotten away with less for whatever that's worth. So altogether, I mean, it's funny because, like I said, all the Yzerman contracts are fantastic, perfect, as good as they possibly could be. All the Brisebois contracts are all things I wouldn't have done. So because you have two fingerprints on this roster and this cap management, it's kind of difficult to give a rating. So I mean, obviously, like for the roster, they've won Stanley Cups and like made the finals last year. I mean, they're fantastic. It's arguably the best team in the league and has been for a while. So you can't say that it's been poorly managed. Obviously, it's impossible to say that. Now, at this point and moving forward, if I had to make a bet, I would bet that this team is going to not be as good because the manager's changed. I could be proven wrong, obviously, and the fact that they still have most of these guys locked up at good contracts, it'll be difficult for me to prove that I'm right. But they'll probably see well, when do these contracts start up? So next year. Yeah. So you know what? In 3 years ish, 3 to 4 years, I think we'll get a good idea of if I'm wrong about the management. I think that it's been done not poorly, but as good, not nearly as good as how Iserman did it. So in 3 to 4 years, if Tampa starts to run into cap trouble and then becomes a team that isn't as competitive, I'll be proven right. And I think that's the way it's trending. But we'll see. So since it's a half and half of Iserman and Brisebois, I mean, I can't give it a bad rating. Um, I I still, as much as I might be bold to say, I don't think I can give, definitely not an A plus. A would be reasonable, but I think I'm going to give Tampa an A minus at this point in time. Um, had it been when Iserman was a GM or before some of these contracts that were signed, then I would say A plus probably. So there's that much of a contrast, I think, between the two approaches. Um, so we'll say A minus for Tampa, and then last up is the Florida Panthers. So Florida, their cap hit is, I didn't realize, so low. So 87. Wait, sorry, I'm confusing things. It's contrast to Tampa, which was 90. So, anyways, 87.17 million. So over the cap. So that's my mistake. Using LTIR. Their GM is Bill Zito, who I'm not familiar with. Starting with the forwards, Barkov, 10 million per 8 years remaining on an 8-year contract. Last year, 88 points, 39 goals in 67 games, 58 points, 26 goals in 50 games, 62 points, 20 goals in 66, 96, 35 goals in 82. So consistently 25 plus goal scorer, over a point per game. Quite a good player. And I think he's also effective defensively, which would make sense because he's a Finnish player. But don't hold me to it. Anyways, he's a stud of a player. Contract was signed in 2021 after a number of consistently good years. 10 million. So this one's like right smack in the middle. So I wouldn't put him quite up there with like McDavid, Draisaitl, Kucherov. I'd have him maybe a step lower. But the problem is he hasn't really played many full seasons. The one he did, 35 goals, 96 points in 82 games. So, and I mean, he had a shortened season last year and nearly put up the same stats. So he's probably in the same boat as the rest of them, but yeah. So anyways, 10 million for him. Obviously market value is perfectly fine. Could have probably made more. So it's probably right about where he should be. And I mean, if maybe could have negotiated down to you saw with Iserman 9.5. Could have maybe got 9.5, but this one was done later, so maybe 10 million is fair at the time that it was signed. So yeah, so good contract, obviously. Probably as good as you could have done. Matthew Tkachuk, 9.5 million per 8 years remaining on an 8-year contract. Last year, 104 points, 42 goals in 82 games, 43 and 56, 61 with 23 goals in 69, 77 with 34 goals in 80. Was signed in the off season. Which was after that great year. It's still only 9.5, so yeah, I mean, it's pretty much the same sort of thing as Barkov, so he's worth it. Probably right dead center of what he should make. So I'd say great contract, and he's got sandpaper to him, so it's good in that regard too. Next up, Sam Reinhart, 6.5 per 2 years remaining on a 3-year contract. Last year, 82 points, 33 goals in 78 games, 40 points, 25 goals in 54, 50 points, 22 goals in 69, 65, 22 goals in 82. So consistently 20-plus goal scorer, just shy of a point per game previously. Was signed in 2021 after consistently good years. Now, why he was only signed to a 3-year contract, I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me. Him, it would have been a no-brainer to sign long term, so I don't know why that didn't happen. 6.5 for him is perfect. Another great contract. Just should have been long term. So I think that's a mistake there. Again, don't know the circumstance, but yeah, should have been longer term. Next up, Patrick Hornqvist, 5.3 million per last year of a 5-year contract. Last year, 28 points, 65 games, 32 and 44, 32 and 52, 37 and 69. So somewhere around a 30 to 40 point player. Was signed in 2018 after many good years with 20 some odd goals, which is quite good. At 5.3 is a steal for what you had there. Under a point per game, but 20 some odd goals at 5.3. That's a great contract. And then to pick that up is great as well. Now, he's dipped slightly in his performance since previously, but when did they pick him up? They picked him up in 2020, which would have been after he had dipped. So what did they trade for him? Seaver and Matheson. Seaver's not playing. Matheson is a decent defenseman. So maybe gave up too much. Yeah, to have that other defenseman around, I wouldn't have made that trade given the dip in performance, but um, whatever it's not bad anyways. So yeah, not a bad contract to have on the books and was signed well at the time that it was made. And that's it for forward. So their core is basically 2 to 8 years. And all the people that should be locked up are, for the most part, except for Sam Reinhart, should have been locked up. And otherwise, there's flexibility where they need it. So say really, really well done there. On defense, only one contract to cover, which is Ekblad, $7.5 million per 3 years remaining on an 8-year contract. Last year, 57 points in 61 games, 22 in 35, 41 in 67, 37 in 82. So high-performing defenseman, especially last year. Was signed in 2016 after 2 decent years, and he had great pedigree. So 7.5 at that time. I mean, really smart, well done, great job. Couldn't have been done better. So, and he's worth a 7.5. So, great contract. Their core between 2 and 3 years left. So, lots of flexibility. Things were signed as they should have been when they were, and everything's fine. Then goalies, we've got Bobrovsky, 10 million per 4 years remaining on a 7-year contract. Last year, 913 in 54 games, 906 in 31, 900 in 50, 913 in 62. So somewhere around a 9-1 something save percentage goalie. This year again, he's had struggled, but yeah, was signed in 2019 after all of his back-to-back really good years, which is how he got that 10 million. And that's in the realm of the carry price thing, as we mentioned previously with Vasilevsky. So at the time of the contract, was he the best goalie or one of the best goalies in the league? Yeah. But $10 million for a goalie is far too high for me. So I don't like it. Is it market value? Yes. Would I do it? Definitely not. And this is where it gets kind of weird. They have Spencer Knight last year of a 3-year, I think it's his entry level contract? Yeah, entry level contract. So 925,000. Last year 908 save percentage in 32 games, and then that's basically all his experience. Now was signed to a 3-year extension, 4.5 million. That was signed this past off season after one kind of decent year, but shortened. Is he worth 4.5? I don't think so. I mean, good pedigree, first round pick, played World Juniors. So, I mean, projecting up, but then you only sign him for 3 years, and you have Bobrovsky at 10 million. how can you have so much locked up in 2 goalies? Like, that doesn't make any sense. So what you should have done, if you like this guy, sign him for 8 years or whatever, 6 years if you're concerned from lack of track record, and then trade Bobrovsky if you could, but seems like they can't. So then why would you sign a guy for 4.5 million? So it's 14.5 million for their 2 goalies. That just doesn't make any. That's the equivalent of 2 starters. Like, what was it for Hellebuck? 7 point something million? No, 6.167. Like, you could have 2 Hellebucks on your team, and you have a Spencer Knight and a Bobrovsky. Uh, so I don't know what they're doing, what their plans are, but they need to fix that and fix it quick, because that's going to be next year is going to be trouble. Florida's window could be this year only, with that kind of cap issue. So don't know what they're going to do there. So altogether, I mean, missed opportunity signing Reinhardt. Otherwise, fine for forwards. Defense, they only have Ekblad. The rest of the guys are all kind of average defensemen. I mean, unless you want to say Montour is good, he's not bad. So just with that, so the roster is going to be good this year. They have a number of contracts expiring. So, but none of them are really critical contracts, it looks like. Give me 1 sec to scope out a couple of these guys. Yeah, so not critical contracts that are going to turn out being expensive. So they have time to figure out their problem, but only really 2 years. So in 3 years, when Reinhardt expires, see, this is why you would have wanted him locked up. Because if he was 6 point something per locked up still, that would buy you maybe another 3 years. So I think in 3 years they could run into trouble because of his contract expiring and the goalie contracts on the books and other contracts expiring, of course. Because all the defensemen expire after 2 years, excluding Ekblad, which is 3 years. So at that point, at the 3-year mark, when everything expires and you have those 2 goalies on the books, assuming everybody's still there, it's going to be tough to manage. Like, something has to give. They're going to have to do something within 2 years to figure out their goaltending stuff. Otherwise, they're going to run into trouble. Thankfully, all the goalie contracts expire in 4 years, so you can fix things after. But those last 2 years of the goalies, so 3 to 4 years from now, everything's going to be kind of messed up for them. So they're going to have to be really careful. So all things considered, cap management is all mostly good. There's not much wrong except the goaltending situation there. So, and that's a big issue. Thankfully, can be resolved though in a reasonable time frame. So, can't be an A. A minus would be not far off. It's a really competitive team. We'll say There's enough. I'd say it's right in the same category as Toronto and Boston. So yeah, we'll say B plus for Florida. And so that wraps it up for this series on evaluating teams' cap management. We've had a number of decent teams. Just to recap here, give me a second to get back to the grades I have. So teams I liked: Red Wings, Senators, Islanders, Blues, Predators, Stars. Surprisingly enough for the Stars. But that's because of when the contracts were signed, just to keep in mind. Ducks, and that's it. So those are all the A's and A pluses. The best team was a tie between St. Louis and Nashville, in my opinion. And yeah, so I think those two teams, based on my analysis, they'll be in the best shape moving forward. Everyone else, to different degrees, are they'll have their own different things to work on. So that's it. Once again, thanks for tuning in. If you like this stream, hit the like button, share it with your friends, subscribe, turn on notifications. Was 30 minutes late again today, so that can happen, but I should be pretty much on track every day to be around 5 p.m. Eastern, changing to 4 p.m. When the time changes. And yeah, otherwise, now that I'm done this, if you have any other ideas, of course, leave a comment letting me know of a subject that you'd be interested in. If you have feedback, let me know. I know in this series it was pretty long-winded because I was covering a lot of stuff, and for me, I like to get into the weeds on some of this stuff, like talking about contracts, because they matter to evaluating teams' cap management. So for somebody that's into more detailed stuff, I would hope that you would enjoy this. This is my kind of stuff that I'm interested in, so someone like me would enjoy it, and I hope you would. But otherwise, yeah, if you have other stuff, then that way I can meet the needs of a more diverse viewership. So let me know. So once again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again tomorrow with a subject to be determined. We'll see.